really looking at the people, understanding their philosophy, understanding the nature of work, understanding, for example, do they do caucusing? What kind of safety do they create in the room for the parties who are in conflict? How do they manage that, or at least what presence do they bring to that? Do they have comfort with there being conflict and emotion in a room? Exploring those sorts of things, because when people are in pain and when there is conflict, there needs to be room for emotion. There may need to be room for anger. It may not be pleasant, but it will ultimately burn out if it's allowed to. And so those are the things that I think it would be really useful for people to understand as they consider, whether or not mediation is of use to them in working through something, and understanding the types of mediation that are available to them.
The Center for Understanding in Conflict welcomes you to The Other Chair, a monthly podcast exploring the dynamics of conflict and how to bring the human issues to the table. Together with our guests, we explore how the power of understanding each other can lead to better solutions for people on both sides of an issue. We will also share tips for managing your own mediation practice, approaching conflict in the professional world, and ways to apply our understanding-based model in your personal life. Hello to our listeners, and welcome back to The Other Chair. In this episode, we dive into the heart of two mediation experiences that couldn't have been more different, both led by trained professionals, yet with outcomes that left vastly different emotional and relational footprints. Our guest, Ian Warburg, brings the perspective of both a business executive and a therapeutically informed coach. He shares how one mediation, rooted in the understanding-based approach, became a transformative and even healing experience, while another, marked by separate sessions and professional detachment, left trust fractured and conflict unresolved. Welcome, Ian, and thank you for joining us on The Other Chair.
Hello, James. My pleasure. It's good to be here.
Well, it's good to have you here, and it's really exciting and a rare opportunity to get someone who's been on the other side of the mediators going through a mediation, but then also through two different, very opposite approaches to mediation. And so I'm really happy you were able to join us and willing to share your story, because I'm sure it will be of great interest to many of our listeners.
Well, it's my pleasure.
So let's jump in. Let's start with the first mediation that you experienced, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about what led up to that, how you found the mediators in that story, and then what that experience was like for you.
The first mediation took place about 28 years ago. I was going through a separation from the mother of my newly born daughter, or at the time, young daughter. And we had been getting along beautifully. We'd been working, co-parenting beautifully, but it was clear that our relationship was not going to work out. We weren't going to stay together, and we felt it was important to put something in writing about how we would focus on the care and custody of our child, who we both loved enormously. And all of the civility that we enjoyed was immediately lost when the mother of our child had a family friend, her uncle, represent her in the legal proceedings, and he was there to protect her. And he's now deceased, but he is a litigator, a matrimonial lawyer, and he threw a nuclear bomb into our relationship by writing up a complaint, filing with the Superior Court of New York, and really undermined any ounce of trust or rapport that we had enjoyed up until that point. She felt very vulnerable and afraid, and I had been pressing for mediation, having read a book by Melinda Blau called Families Apart. And it was a fascinating book, and it spoke of the importance of remembering that the end of a marriage or the end of a relationship is especially when children are involved, is not the end. It's the beginning of a new relationship on new terms. And her strong recommendation from her own experience was best to mediate if one can, to find a peaceful way to resolve the conflicts and manage the differences, and to get to the other side and to begin the new relationship. Mother of my child wasn't up for that. She had been advised by her uncle that was a terrible idea, that she would fare poorly in that sort of process. And she steadfastly refused. So I went to a conference held by an organization called the Children's Rights Council. And there was a speaker, an attorney named Barry Berkman, New York attorney, talking about the merits of mediation and sharing a lot of his history as a divorce litigator and his recognition that people were coming to him at their most vulnerable times and asking him to do his job, which was to be a zealot in his representation of them. And he saw every case ending the same way, brutally, that people would, exchange barbs, spend tons of money, exhaust themselves financially, exhaust themselves emotionally, only to shake hands and resolve the case on the courthouse steps, having spent many months, sometimes years, knocking it out. And he just could not stand being part of that process. And he had discovered mediation and had found it had transformed his professional life and practice. I was so inspired by the talk he gave that I called him after the seminar and started to share my story. And coincidentally, he knew the lawyer. And when I said the lawyer's name, and I said that he was representing his niece, he said, "Who's the niece?" And I said, mentioned her name, and he said, "Oh my goodness, you got to tell her to give me a call right now." And it turns out he had a child her age. They had been playmates in the sandbox together as children. He'd known her since her earliest days. And I did as he suggested. I called her and said, "Look, I just met with Barry Berkman over the phone. He said, you have to give him a call." She did. The two of us went to meet with him, and he sat us down and explained, what litigation really looks like and what would happen, and what mediation, the possibility of mediation, and what it could provide for us. Noting that we seem like two very reasonable people who, with the right help, could get to a point of resolution that we could both live with, and that we will have co-created. And he offered and made an introduction to Jack Himmelstein, who at the time we didn't really know. He was just a nice, a nice kind of paternal, gentle attorney who was a skilled mediator. And through a number of sessions with him, we came to an incredible resolution to the issues that were in front of us. And it had never needed to be complicated. And while it was in a very emotionally charged process, the mediation, the approach that Jack used to facilitate the dialogue between us and to facilitate our exploration of possibilities enabled us to get to the other side, to get from where we were starting to a place of mutual understanding and agreement that we had arrived at jointly. And it was transformational. And I will say that we had been in therapy together, and even therapy had failed to enable us or to facilitate our understanding of one another in the same way that this approach to mediation helped. We developed trust. We developed, I think, a real empathy for one another, a real understanding about why things were important to one another that we hadn't previously understood or maybe had been suspicious of.
Conflict manifests itself in many ways in our personal lives, for professionals in the workplace and for practitioners who have made a career bringing together parties in conflict through mediation practice. Each month, the Center for Understanding in Conflict hosts live webinars with featured guests discussing best practices and sharing their experiences for tackling conflict using the understanding-based model. How did that first mediation contrast with later the second one that you did? Are there any strong standout differences?
Yeah, I feel I'm kind of amazed that I have this opportunity to talk about two very different experiences, and really both connected to very sad, moments in my life. The contrast could not have been more stark. When I think of our work with Jack Himmelstein and what we were able to accomplish and how it serves us these many years later, we have a wonderful relationship. There's great care for one another, a great appreciation for one another, the importance as people in a family, in a kind of an extended family system. And I find I get very emotional when I think of Jack. So to contrast that, the experience we had with Jack, The other mediator, I was a man I had known. He was a dear friend of a dear friend of mine, and a lovely, lovely man. I mean, just gentle, kind, and someone entirely committed to alternative means of conflict resolution, particularly with marriage. So he focuses his practice is focused on mediation and collaborative divorce. So I went to him not understanding that there are different approaches to mediation. And given his gentle nature, I made the assumption that he would guide us through a process similar to the process I'd been through previously with Jack Himmelstein. Could not have been more different. While we started out in a very understanding way and we set out what our hopes and our dreams were for the mediation process and our reasons for having chosen to mediate the dissolution of our marriage rather than litigate it, or rather than have attorneys representing each of us negotiate and work out the settlement. It started with incredibly high hopes, but very quickly changed and became a much more negative experience for me. And for example, he asked early on if it would be okay for us to caucus individually with him. He said that he often found that it would help, especially at times of conflict or during emotionally charged matters, for him to have individual conversations with each of the parties that he would then use to facilitate a dialogue in joint sessions. And initially, that sounded very reasonable, given the personalities, our personalities, and some of the difficulties we'd found in communicating. But I quickly came to see it became an opportunity for him to be manipulated, and in theory, by either or both of us, that we could each download our stories, our narratives on the other person. And what I came to discover is, as much as he strove to maintain, he would say he's trained to filter the stories. But as much as he worked to filter the stories, I could see that he and the financial advisor that we were working with were both being persuaded by a very persuasive person to not necessarily trust me in the process. And as time went on, there were a number of incidents where I had spoken to him about certain things in our private meetings that he was, said he would facilitate, and he didn't. He threw me under the bus in any number on multiple occasions where he would say, well, we had gotten through a very good piece of work. We'd kind of gone through a number of issues. And rather than bringing this up or managing that one issue that he and I had discussed privately, that he said he would discuss privately with my now former wife, he didn't discuss it with her. And worse, at the most vulnerable time in the discussion, he'd say, Ian, I know there was something else you wanted to say. And it was impossible. It was either I would risk, it put at risk blowing up the progress we had made and making me into the bad guy, which was the opposite of what he had said he would do and what he said he would understand. And it was dishonest in that he didn't say to me, well, no, Ian, I can't do that. You're going to need to have that discussion yourself. And I think he could have said that would have been, a more appropriate approach, but instead he didn't. And he did this on numerous occasions. And at the most crucial parts of the negotiation, at a point where, had I brought that up, it probably would have derailed the entire negotiation and set us back. And there were a number of times when we did have setbacks. So those are a couple of examples. Another example was I had discovered in reviewing the financial statement that the financial planner had put together. It was put together using a program that doesn't translate to Excel. So I had to go and recreate all of the numbers myself. And in working out the numbers, I realized there was an error, and a significant one. I wasn't sure who the beneficiary of that error was, but I knew there was an error. So I called a meeting with the mediator and with the financial planner, and we went through my numbers. And her immediate response, the financial planners, was, "Oh my goodness, thank you. You've caught a tremendous mistake." And it was actually a mistake that was very much to my benefit, but not to my now former wife's. So I was very happy, but I now my trust in this woman's, you know, abilities was at least called into question. I think she's very talented, thought she was very good, and she made a mistake. It happens. She recast the numbers. Did my analysis again, recast it, and I asked her to ask them both that we again go through the numbers line by line, just to make sure, one, that I understood them, and two, that they were accurate. At this point, both she rolled her eyes and huffed and puffed, and by the way, is also a trained mediator, and showed, kind of dismay and disgust with me. And I called her on it and asked her, what was upsetting to her about my making this request. I've hired you to help me make an informed decision about my future. And I'm asking to verify that, one, I understand the numbers and that the numbers themselves are accurate. And she apologized and went backwards. But she at first refused flat out to talk about my numbers. My mediator, the gentleman, started screaming at me, refusing. I mean, literally raising his voice, angry with me, telling me the numbers we were working with were hers. We weren't looking at my numbers. And that was that. And I was shocked. And I reminded him, I said, again, this is not, I'm not doing this, you know, to prolong things. I'm doing this to make sure I understand what I'm agreeing to and that the information is accurate. He calmed down later and we got through it and we got to an agreement. We got to an understanding around an agreement and later had a final session. But prior to that, I called him on the telephone to go over, having slept on the numbers and my understanding. And I called him on the telephone and I said, I inquired, I asked, what was it that he felt was appropriate about his conduct? And how is it that he was yelling at me? And, we had a nice rapport and he apologized and he said, I get a little frustrated sometimes, but he then went on to say, actually, in a confession, he said, it's a little lawyerly technique. He said he finds that sometimes in mediation, parties get comfortable with the process and it doesn't end. And he said, so my job is to create some urgency and, urgency in the form of screaming at me. And I pointed out to him, I said, he did nothing to motivate me. In fact, he did everything to scare me into believing that I was dealing with a very faulty process that I could not trust, that I was not safe in this process.
So, Ian, I think you've done a wonderful job of illustrating how the presence or absence of a shared space, either mediating altogether or through caucusing, especially bringing in other support parties to, in some cases, complicate the issues. What I'd like to ask you now is more around the role of emotional safety and how your experience in your first mediation, which was understanding based, either fostered that or left you wanting, and how that did or did not show up in the second one, and what impact that had for you overall in that process.
In the first instance, in the understanding-based model, I was struck by, and as I said, I become quite emotional when I think of it, was the calm presence that the mediator brought to the room, the way he spoke with us using the techniques where the empathy-based techniques were used and we were able to listen to one another, and he was able to report back or to state back his understanding of what he had heard. And I found that over time, I was hearing and understanding my former partner. She was hearing and understanding me. And neither of us felt threatened in the way that we had previously, both in therapy and when we were dealing with litigation. He had created a very safe environment in which we could be seen and heard, and where there was a space for holding the very intense emotions that were sometimes in the room. And there was a lot of crying that took place. And I will say, I noticed at times he was moved. He never broke character. He never stepped out of his role. But we could see, both of us could see, that he cared very deeply for the process, he was honoring the process, cared deeply that we were responsible for it. And I think, his role and presence and his approach to inquiry created an enormous sense of felt safety, emotional safety, and allowed us to work through our emotions and then work through the issues. Completely different in the second case. No emotional safety. While it started with emotional safety, I think what I explained previously, I began to really doubt whether or not mediation was going to work for us, whether or not it was going to get me a fair outcome, and really didn't end up feeling at all emotionally safe, or that I could trust any of the parties in the system to take care of making sure that this process honored us all equally. So very different. Ended up feeling, not safe emotionally, not, the mediator's job is not to represent me or my partner, but it's to represent the couple and a process through which we can, in a non-adversarial way, work through to a resolution of outstanding issues, related to the dissolution of a long marriage. And so I came out of that feeling, an enormous sense of mistrust, a real sense of disappointment. And I would say, not to overstate it, but a sense of betrayal. I had been led to believe I would have one experience and wound up having another one entirely. And it became, really came down to an economic decision that, had we broken off and had the mediation failed, we would have probably ended up spending, lots of time, emotional energy, and countless dollars to get to probably some version of a similar outcome, but with a lot less money to share. And so I conceded, to a great many points that I don't think I should have, and I don't think had we done the first process, I don't think either of us would have. I think we both would have ended up feeling much better about the outcome we got. And as a consequence, interestingly, that lack of emotional safety, my former wife and I had an amazing relationship. Clearly it had its flaws, and clearly we got onto different paths, but we entered into mediation very lovingly with a real appreciation for one another and a real feeling, of personal safety with one another. And the process of the mediation eroded that so completely that we at this point, it's not that long after, but at this point we have next to no communication and no interest in communicating because a real bitterness has taken over where there had previously been mutual respect and trust and appreciation.
Throughout the year, the Center for Understanding in Conflict hosts in-depth basic and advanced certificate programs designed to train you to become effective mediators and conflict resolution professionals centered in the understanding-based model. Our training programs have been the gold standard in alternative dispute resolution for 40 years and is popular within the legal community with human resource professionals, ombudsmen, and corporate workplace mediation clients. I think you hit the nail on the head, as people say, when you mentioned that in the second process that was far more difficult and painful, as you've described it, that you were led to believe one thing and then another happened. And I think the key in there is that you were led, whereas in the understanding-based approach, in the first mediation you cited as an example, it's more about holding space and encouraging understanding between two individuals. And so from the very start, there may have been a flaw based on how your experiences went. So I'd like to move a little bit into your professional experience and just talk about your perspective of this. What insights from your work as a coach or your background in systems thinking help you make sense of what happens?
In the understanding based approach to mediation or conflict resolution, there's this technique called looping. It's similar to another technique that I would call dialogue, where the role of each party is to seek to understand before being understood, and that the discussion can take place once each party understands the other as the other intends to be understood. And so my job in talking to you would be to ask you questions of clarification, to repeat back to you that which I heard you say, and for you to confirm that, yes, I do understand you as you intend for me to do. And similarly, you can do the same with me. And then once we have that understanding of one another, we're able to then explore the issues and have discussions. And I find that when that can take place, and when people can create, when there's a safe space in which people can do that without having to jump to the defensive or to make sure that they're listening, listening in order to prepare their response, and they're just waiting for their opportunity, but that their role is actually not to respond, but to really listen and to seek understanding. Major difference in what happens. And so in my practice, when I'm working with couples, helping them to understand one another in that way, having them slow down to really understand what is important and why is it important. And then when you get to why is it important, what is that? And kind of the ladder of inference, let's go deeper and try to understand even more, so that these couples, the defenses can come down and they can develop a sense of safety in exploring what's going on without having to feel as self-protective or as defensive, without having to feel that they may lose something in that experience. And so it's creating a structure, a framework, an environment in which two people who are in relationship with one another, and it's really whether they're in a marriage or in a professional relationship, but it's an important relationship. It's creating a system that enables people to understand one another and to at least check their assumptions or validate them or have them completely dispelled and move them from a place of what they thought might have been the case to a place of what actually is.
So you talked a little about the nuts and bolts of how this has showed up in your work professionally, but I'd be curious to know from a more personal level, how these two very personal experiences with two different mediators and models and marriages have shaped your own professional work and the evolution of it as you have grown to work with individuals and organizations experiencing conflict.
I had long been impressed with the experience I had in the first mediation and really inspired by that experience. So much so that I recommended Jack Himmelstein to anyone I met who was going through a divorce. And he ended up doing God's work for a number of dear friends and helping them through what seemed like an impossible time in their lives. I'd always wanted to become a mediator or to be trained. And in those days, going back 25 or so years, I think the Center for Understanding and Conflict was really focused more on training lawyers, occasionally therapists. I wasn't a therapist at the time, but the audience, at least as I recall, hadn't broadened to include others in helping professions in the way that it is being done today. But when I ran into this most recent experience and was kind of so stunned to discover that mediation has different meanings to different people and that there are different approaches and different techniques. And in discovering that, I was inspired to find Jack. And I went looking for Jack, found, of course, the Center of Understanding in Conflict on the web, and reached out and enrolled in a training, in the intensive basic training that was offered in California. So I was inspired so much so by the experience I had, by the sense of healing and peace that was created in the first experience, and so horrified by the experience I had in the second, that I was inspired to get trained, because I do know from experience that there are better ways of helping people through very difficult relational times, and that the training that the center offers would be useful to me as I worked with people both in business settings and in their personal relationships.
This podcast is supported by our CUC Connect members, whose yearly membership includes free attendance to our live monthly webinars, 12 additional featured recordings of past training events, and support from our network of certified trainers for continued professional development. Consider joining CUC Connect today and dive deeper into the understanding-based. So, Ian, we're just about out of time. Last question that I have for you. What advice would you have for someone who is either considering personal mediation for a relationship such as yours that's coming to a conclusion, or who's considering workplace conflict resolution programs, or bringing a practitioner in to help analyze their systems and give advice from that perspective?
People have to really look at who they're in who they're in relationship with, whether it's at work or in their personal lives, and what is the nature of that relationship? What is the nature of their communication? And where do they stumble and struggle the most? Not necessarily they themselves, but as a system. Where does this system seem to break down? And first, it's important to really determine if a mediated solution is the right one, or if maybe there is the need for other representation to help facilitate the resolution of the conflict. And that can take just take some care and time. When it comes to mediation, I think, it would be wonderful if customers, consumers of these services understood that mediation as a term has many meanings and that there are many legitimate trained approaches to mediation that exist, and to understand what the differences of those approaches may be. Also to look at the professional, the various professionals you may be seeking, and to understand some of their training. Many of the mediators, and this mediator I dealt with most recently was a matrimonial attorney, a very senior guy, probably in his late 70s, with loads of experience. And as I said, super kind-hearted, a gentle, gentle soul who believes in, non-adversarial conflict resolution, although he used very coercive techniques throughout. Now, had I understood that, and had I understood that he was being lawyerly, I would not have selected that approach to working through our conflict. So I think it's important to understand, the practitioner. Sometimes a lawyer working as a mediator can't help but to be a lawyer. The legal training gets people a certain type of training to behave in a certain way. And not to say that it's universal. And it's, Jack Himmelstein, a very accomplished attorney and an amazing mediator in the understanding-based approach. So it can certainly be overcome. I think really looking at the people, understanding their philosophy, understanding the nature of work, understanding, for example, do they do caucusing? What kind of safety do they create in the room for the parties who are in conflict? How do they manage that, or at least what presence do they bring to that? Do they have comfort with there being conflict and emotion in a room? Exploring those sorts of things, because when people are in pain and when there is conflict, there needs to be room for emotion. There may need to be room for anger. It may not be pleasant, but it will ultimately burn out if it's allowed to. And so those are the things that I think it would be really useful for people to understand as they consider, whether or not mediation is of use to them in working through something, and understanding the types of mediation that are available to them.
Ian, thank you so much for your openness and reflection today. Your experiences really bring to life the core principles of the understanding-based approach, and remind us and those who are understanding-based practitioners that how we do mediation is just as important as what we're mediating. So thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you for having me.
Ian Warburg is a seasoned business executive, board advisor, and therapeutically informed executive coach. He holds a degree in international affairs and economics from NYU, organizational development from American University, and marriage and family therapy from Southern Connecticut State University. If you would like to reach out to Ian, please email iwarburg, IWARBURG, @me.com. To learn more about the understanding-based approach and training opportunities for mediators, especially those in New York, from trainers who have learned from Jack Himmelstein, visit understandinginconflict.org. Thank you to today's guest for being with us today, and to our CUC Connect members whose support enables the Center for Understanding in Conflict to bring new perspectives in the field of conflict resolution and mediation to you, our listener, in each new episode. You can find out more about today's episode, along with full interviews and additional information about conflict resolution and mediation using the understanding-based model at www.understandinginconflict.org.